Hi, welcome to Beginner Zen. So, for one reason or another, you've decided to read a book on Zen. Maybe you've studied other branches of Buddhism and you want to find out what that Zen school is all about. Maybe you watch Kung Fu with David Carradine and you were curious about what they were talking about. Actually, a lot of the wisdom in that show actually comes from the Tao Te Ching, so only tangentially related to Zen. Or maybe you just know Zen is associated with peace and serenity, and you'd like a little more of that in your life. Whatever you're doing it. That was the boat I was in about 3 months ago. For me, I'd read some books by Thich Nhat Hanh, and there were a couple questions I had that weren't maybe being answered as thoroughly as I was hoping, and I was thinking, well, maybe Zen has more answers there. Of course, little did I know that Zen, you're less likely to get answers on those very topics. But regardless, I decided I was going to read my first book on Zen. So today I'm going to share with you, basically, if I had a friend or family member that asked me, you know, what book on Zen should I read first? Having just done that myself, what would I recommend? Again, just to say, since I'm a beginner, I really know very little about Zen. I'm just sharing my experience from having dived in myself. Arguably, maybe you should just ignore all the recommendations and just do what feels right for you, and feel free to go that route. But for me today, I'm just going to share, if someone was asking me, hey, Mark, what should I read first? This is what I would say. So when I started searching for recommendations on a good first book to read in Zen, I saw recommendations. I saw one person recommending two books. Introduction to Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki, and then Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by, I think it's pronounced Shunryu Suzuki. I think there's a couple ways people pronounce it. And so I saw those two books recommended, and to me, between those two, I thought Introduction to Zen Buddhism sounds a little more basic, a little more straightforward. And I also just thought the name D.T. Suzuki sounded like a Zen name. I don't know. It jumped out at me, and Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind felt maybe a little more abstract. So I went for the D.T. Suzuki book. And then while I was going to buy it, I saw another book on Amazon called Zen and the Art of Happiness. And I saw some good reviews for that book, and people seemed to be inspired by it. So I grabbed that as well. And that was actually the first book I read, Zen and the Art of Happiness. And basically, the author of that book, they talk a little bit about Zen, but it's not really about Zen. That author, the whole premise of the book is basically everything in life that happens to you is the best thing that can happen to you. And they really suggest strongly that, if you can shift your mind so that you see everything that happens as the best thing that could be happening to you in that moment, that'll be transformative, and your life will have tremendous benefits as a result. And on one hand, I do think that it does kind of get at this Zen idea. There's this Zen story where this farmer keeps having, these successive events happen where it seems like a tragedy, and then it's a huge turnaround, and then it's another tragedy, and then wait, things are good again, and all the way along, he says, this could be good, this could be bad, who can say? And so this book is kind of saying something similar. It's like, yeah, treat everything as the best thing, but I guess when you treat everything as that, you are kind of treating it the same, and in a sense, it's breaking down that distinction of good and bad. And so in that sense, it is kind of getting at a Zen principle, I would say, but I think it's also really hard to put into practice, because it's easy to say, okay, this is the best thing that could happen to me. But when you hit that really rough patch, I think you're also maybe more likely to say, I'm done with this. This can't be the best thing that could happen to me. So overall, it was kind of one note that is kind of the author's theme. So I didn't get a lot out of it. And as an introduction to Zen, my first Zen book, I wouldn't recommend that as a place to start in Zen, given it's not really about Zen. So next, I followed that by reading, Introduction to Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki, and not knowing really anything about it, but as it turns out, I mean, D.T. Suzuki is basically a Buddhist scholar. I'm not sure how much he practices Zen Buddhism, practices Zazen. Maybe he does, but I think it's much more of an intellectual approach that he takes. Yeah, so gets into kind of all these illogical sayings of Zen masters and, some of the, intense practices that they undertook to reach enlightenment, cutting off fingers and throwing people over fences and these kind of radical, to us at least, it seems like radical steps to bring people to enlightenment. Again, all these illogical sayings here, I'll read a couple. So yeah, at one point he talks about, how these masters answered the question, who or what is Buddha? And you get all these different kind of illogical sayings, he is no Buddha, your name is Yecho. I really love that one. 3 pounds of flax. That's a really famous one. But yeah, as again, someone that was thinking they would get maybe some more practical wisdom from the book, it wasn't really focused on that. And there were a couple parts that were a little unnerving to someone that was just starting out and practicing. He's talking about Satori and, saying without the attainment of Satori, no one can enter into the truth of Zen. Satori is the raison d'etre of Zen, without which Zen is no Zen. Therefore, every contrivance, disciplinary or doctrinal, is directed toward Satori. So it's putting a lot of weight on Satori, having just kind of explained it and just kind of getting your head around it as a beginner. And again, he goes into great length about, just the strenuous practices that were undertaken by these Zen masters. And, they're in seemingly better circumstances to reach Satori than me, and yet the lengths that they had to go to, Bodhidharma staring at a wall for 9 years. You have Dogen leaving Japan to go to China to try and get back to like the truth of Zen and the original teaching. And it's like, yeah, so why me just getting started with a practice? Like, what hope do I have if it took, these Zen masters went to such great lengths to practice? And I think those fears are, normal and good for Zen practice. But, for a first book on Zen, I think I found D.T. Suzuki's work a little intimidating and more focused on the intellectual than the practical. So right here, he says, when Zen is said to be illogical and irrational, timid readers, like myself, are frightened and may wish to have nothing to do with it, but I'm confident that the present chapter, devoted to practical Zen, will mitigate whatever harshness and uncouthness there may have been in it when it was intellectually treated. For me, I guess I still found it a little harsh in the sense that it doesn't really, I don't think the book really helps a beginner feel like this practice is something that could be worthwhile for them, in the sense that it's such a high standard that it feels like there's a standard to attain and I couldn't possibly attain it, which is, I don't think, the right mindset for a beginner. But that's kind of the feeling that, again, as a complete beginner, I kind of walked away from reading this book with. So those were my 2 first books that I read, and I walked away feeling like I didn't know much more about Zen than when I started, which maybe is a good thing. But I kind of felt like, well, maybe Zen just isn't for me. And, maybe I should go back to focusing on Mahayana. And I kind of felt like, well, maybe I can find a book that's a little more practical, a little more relatable, and that can kind of open the door for me. So the next book I read was Hardcore Zen, and I love this book. It really did kind of demystify the aura of the Zen master, because Brad Warner, the author of the book, for one thing, he doesn't like the title Zen master at all. Certainly doesn't apply it to himself, but he really comes across as just, your everyday American guy just trying to get by in Zen, and has practiced for over 30 years now. But I think he really does a good job of making Zen feel like it's a practice that can be embraced by really anyone. You don't have to be from Japan. You don't have to have incredible intellectual insight, which I think he does. But walking away from the book, it didn't feel like I need to get my head around these illogical Zen sayings. He really emphasized, I think, just sticking with the practice. Making a practice and sticking to it and letting it kind of shape you and mold you, and as you kind of grow into the practice over time. It's more of a kind of an autobiography, but I think it's entertaining, it's relatable, and I think for me it kind of rejuvenated my interest in Zen. I don't think I would recommend it as a first book in Zen because it's a little more of an autobiography, and I think maybe a book that's more geared towards a beginner just starting out is maybe a little bit better. But I would say this is a great book for someone early in their Zen practice, but maybe not the very first book. So those are kind of the first books I read. I'll give you one more before I give my kind of what I would tell a friend, what I would start with. I read Taking the Path of Zen by Robert Aiken Roshi, and that one really is written as more of a straightforward, almost like a manual for starting a Zen practice. And if that's what you're looking for, I think it does a really great job at that. It really, spells out, how to practice Zazen, the etiquette to, doing Zazen and bowing and everything like that in the Zendo. He talks about that. Talks about koan study and how that can be incorporated into a practice. It's a good, I think, fairly concise kind of handbook to starting a Zen practice. I wouldn't say it's particularly gentle, but I wouldn't say it's harsh either. I think it's very straightforward. And so if you're really looking for something that was written as kind of a manual for new practitioners, it really does fit the bill. All right, so the book that I would recommend that, again, friends or family or anyone that kind of asks me where to start, it's actually, I would say, two books. And the reason I would give both is I think one is a little more abstract and gets a little more into the intellectual side in a way that's still very relatable and approachable. The other, I think, is a little more practical, I think, but very much, I felt encouraged, which is maybe not, again, maybe you're supposed to do this the hard way and you're supposed to, not be relying on anything or anyone to power you through your practice, or I don't know. All I know is that it really felt like a very committed and passionate teacher's attempt to kind of bring their new students along. So that's why I kind of give these two books. So the first one, I'll say, is the ultimate classic for beginners, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. This one, for a lot of people, they'd say this is the definitive beginner's book in Zen, and I'd say it's that for a reason. I think what I like best about Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is it feels like a good balance of practical and, again, those kind of illogical, non-dualistic ideas that are kind of, mind expanding, for lack of a better word, and is part of that beginning the journey into Zen. You're going to have these ideas that are, that don't make sense, that are maybe hard to swallow, that, are just totally opposite from the way that you usually see them. And I think that's good to have in the book. He talks about, keeping your thoughts under control or not. He says the best way to control people, and he's basically talking about ourselves, is to encourage them to be mischievous. Then they will be in control in a wider sense. To give your sheep or cow a larger spacious meadow is the way to control them. So it is with people. First, let them do what they want and watch them. This is the best policy. To ignore them is not good. This is the worst policy. The second worst is trying to control them. The best one is to watch them. Just to watch them without trying to control them. Another one, in my first video, I mentioned how my favorite quote about what Zen is basically that Zen is your ordinary life. And he says something similar. He says, Zen is not some kind of excitement, but concentration on our usual everyday routine. If you become too busy and too excited, your mind becomes rough and ragged. So, it's kind of pointing us to that, getting in the flow of your everyday life, simply doing things as they need to be done and not thinking about them is the way to go. So, again, I think it's a blend of practical advice, and maybe it's practical advice, but in a way that is still kind of abstract and maybe pushing our boundaries on what a beginner might be comfortable with, that I think makes the book what it is. So that's one of the two books, and I would say, read that back to back or along with another book, which I think is my favorite kind of practical Zen book for a beginner, and that is Everyday Zen by Charlotte Joko Beck. And like Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, the book is kind of compiled from talks that Charlotte Beck gave to her students. It's very much geared towards, I think, students practicing Zen in the West. How do you practice Zen within the context of everyday life here? She didn't start Zen practice, I think, until she was in her late 40s. She had a career before then, raised a family. And, her guidance is very much, I think, especially geared towards people in that situation. I really like what she says about enlightenment here. She says, enlightenment is not something you achieve. It is the absence of something. All your life you have been going forward after something, pursuing some goal. Enlightenment is dropping all that. And I think after reading D.T. Suzuki's book, this kind of brought me back. And it's like, well, Satori is the goal. You need to be working towards this goal. And Charlotte Beck is saying, actually drop the goals. Enlightenment is about dropping your goals, which again feels, that's like topsy-turvy, but, it's harder than pursuing a goal. Like this is the hard stuff. This isn't gentle. This is like, you need to do something really hard, which is actually dropping every goal you maybe thought you had coming into this practice. One more thing that kind of encouraged me, because I've been having a lot of discomfort and pain during meditation, which I'll definitely talk about more in my next video. But she said about pain, nobody can experience our lives for us. Nobody can feel for us the pain that life inevitably brings. Pain becomes easier when you realize that you're the only one that can do it. There's no way to get out of it because your pain is something that only you can experience. Which on one hand sounds like it should be demoralizing, but then you realize I'm just doing the thing that only I can do, and it's the most natural thing in the world. So at the end of the day, I'd recommend reading those two together, and I'll end the video by giving, I found this review from someone describing why actually they didn't enjoy, or they didn't think Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind was the right book to start with. They actually recommended starting with Everyday Zen. So the reviewer says, I found myself trying to mine a few words of relevant wisdom from chapter after chapter of semi-opaque discourse. Welcome to Zen, I guess. She said, a true beginner is the person off the street who is sincerely interested in Zen but doesn't know why he or she should start a practice. This person is full of problems. Life is really problematic. Life is really hard and painful. What can Zen Buddhism say to such a person? Suzuki Roshi talks a lot of typically riddle-ish circles about emptiness and expression, calmness and oneness. His audience are serious Zen students. I would counter that and say, I think you should be a little uncomfortable reading Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And I think that's actually, Zen should make you kind of uncomfortable, and it shouldn't all make complete sense. But at the same time, I got discouraged by reading, the first couple books I read on Zen. So I would say, again, maybe more important than anything is I would recommend to someone that wants to read a book on Zen, read at least a couple of books. Say I'm going to read these 2 or 3 or whichever books you find right for you. For the reasons that reviewer was saying, I do think pairing Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind with Everyday Zen makes for actually a really good duo. So you get a good dose of the really practical Zen and how you'd use it in your everyday life, along with those uncomfortable, illogical sayings that are going to push you intellectually as well. So yeah, a lot of all the books I mentioned today I think are really good books, but those 2 that I mentioned are the ones that I would recommend to a beginner just starting out. So, but you do what's right for you.